US Vice President JD Vance says a first round of negotiations with senior Iranian officials has laid a good foundation for a successful deal to end the Iran war. Negotiators are currently in Switzerland trying to hammer out the details of a durable final agreement after Washington and Tehran signed a so-called memorandum of understanding last week. After the first round of talks, Vice President Vance announced what he called a milestone in curbing Iran's nuclear program.
The Iranians have agreed to invite IAEA inspectors back into their country. That is a major milestone for the American people and the first step in permanently denuclearizing or permanently ending a nuclear weapons program in Iran. We laid a very good foundation for a successful final deal. The final deal is the house. We set the foundation. We haven't built the house, but we've laid a successful foundation to get to a good place for the American people.
Well, let's look over the blueprints with Nate Swanson, who served as the US National Security Council's director for Iran under the Biden administration. Last year, he was part of the Trump administration's Iran negotiating team. He's currently director of the Iran Strategy Project at the Atlantic Council. Welcome to DW. Let's start with this memorandum of understanding. Not a peace deal, but a document outlining the conditions still to be negotiated under which peace can be achieved. What do you see as its strengths?
I think its biggest strength is it ended the war, right? And I think it's shown that any future fighting doesn't really have any utility, and that was the right decision by the president, right? And to make it clear that he had no desire to go back to fighting, and then in theory not make any more belligerent threats. But that's its greatest strength. I mean, its weakness is that it has a lot of holes. Let's talk about some of those holes. What do you see as the biggest holes in this? The biggest hole is that there's not really a clear path to a deal. What's outlined in the MOU is, like I said, it codifies the ceasefires, but there's not a clear path towards a Strait of Hormuz that is open and free and not being subjected to tolls or fees. There is not a clear path towards a good nuclear deal that really makes sense. And even though, JD Vance was right to say it's really important to have the IAEA back in, there's not really a deal that is probably achievable and significant at the same time. And then I think lastly, it's really the biggest weakness of the MOU is that it's beholden to things that are outside of the control. This Lebanon ceasefire is going to be very volatile and very hard to manage for both the U.S. and for Iran.
Let's talk about a couple of those issues, and we'll start with the Strait of Hormuz. We'll hear from the Vice President talking about the Strait, the utterly predictable trump card, if I can use that term, that Iran played that still seemed to take the White House and the Pentagon by surprise.
We wanted to build a mechanism for keeping the Strait of Hormuz open. It is open. We've seen, of course, gas prices and oil prices come down, but we also wanted to make sure that we actually set up the coordination mechanism so that we could demine the Straits of Hormuz, so that when there are the conflicts that inevitably come up, we can make sure we work through them rather than that leading to escalation.
So, Nate Swanson, is there any world in which Iran can be trusted not to exercise control over this vital waterway?
No, as it's currently constructed, it doesn't appear to be that way, right? Remember, the day before the war, on February 27th, the ships were going back to and from through the Strait of Hormuz at a great rate with no limitations. And what's being set up now is anything but that, right? Iran wants to both coordinate what's going in and out through the IRGC, which is sanctioned, of course, by the U.S. and the European Union and others. And it wants to use it to make money. So I think ultimately this is probably an unsustainable situation for all parties involved, including the U.S., including Europe, our Asian, consumers of products from the Middle East, and for the Gulf countries themselves. So this is untenable long term, but there doesn't seem to be a clear way out of this for either party.
Except there is this promised $300 billion reconstruction fund, which we would presume will have all sorts of strings attached, including several labelled Strait of Hormuz.
That's right. just thinking more broadly about this, I think of the MOU as in two different things, right? There's what it actually does, which is to codify the ceasefire and give Iran some immediate sanctions relief, which happened earlier today, right? That they are now allowed to sell Iranian oil. But then the rest of it's aspirational. And that includes the $300 billion fund and any Iranian nuclear concessions, and unfortunately the Strait of Hormuz. And so moving forward, we may never see the $300 billion. We may never see Iranian nuclear concessions, but we have to have some clarity on the Strait that ideally involves no restrictions on traffic. I mean, that is the one thing, no party can live with, other than Iran.
I've seen you've written recently in Foreign Policy magazine, you've written that Iran's leadership is at risk of overplaying its hand, especially with regard to the Strait. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, so, I mean, look, the Strait of Hormuz has proven to be an extremely useful weapon for Iran, right? I don't think there will ever be another American president who kind of sleepwalks into war thinking there'll be no repercussions or consequences. Everyone knows that if Iran is attacked again, Iran will shut down the Strait. The risk for Iran is that I think they could significantly overplay their hand here. The utility of the Strait is a security guarantee. If Iran is using it to make money, to try to hold the Gulf hostage and try to for ransom payments and using it often, I think it will strengthen the arguments for those who want the war to continue. And it just makes, and like I said, I just think it's completely untenable for normal commerce. You can't have a situation where European, Asian, and Gulf consumers and suppliers can't get in and out easily. So that is a situation I think ultimately leads back to conflict. And that's why I think Iran is very much overplaying their hand right now.
Amongst the weaknesses you outlined was detail on the nuclear issue. Ahead of this interview, we heard JD Vance speaking about the latest round of talks, saying that Tehran will allow nuclear inspectors back into the country. How big a deal is that so early in this 60-day timeline?
It's important, but it's not a big concession, right? Iran is a signatory of the NPT, which requires them to do certain inspections that as a signatory. So, right, the IAEA is allowed to have what's called the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement, which allows them to visit Iranian nuclear sites. Iran pulled that back in 2025 for the first time after the 12-day war. So, yes, it is very important for them to get there, but it's barely getting to the starting line, right? The hard part comes when Iran actually has to do an enhanced inspection regime like we had under the JCPOA, or even after what Europe negotiated in 2003. So we're nowhere close to that. But yes, this is the first step and is absolutely essential.
I've seen it written in lots of places that the Iranians have consistently out-negotiated the US in this conflict. You've been in the room. How true do you think that is?
I think it's true, and I think it's mostly to do with the U.S. not really understanding how existential this war was to Iran, right? I mean, for the U.S., I think we approached this rather, unfortunately, casually and without thinking through the costs and consequences, where for Iran, if they lose this war, the regime falls, they have nowhere to go. So I think, the U.S. has consistently underestimated how willing Iran was to both fight this war, continue this war of attrition, and then ultimately not make compromises. So what you have now is an MOU that is extremely favorable to Iran, right? The U.S. gives concessions up front. Even in the whether the long-term deal happens or not, Iran can live with this. They're going to be getting, approximately $1 billion a month in additional oil revenue that wasn't there before the war. And they're basically getting it, for nothing. And they haven't even opened the Strait. So, yeah, they've definitely out-negotiated the U.S., but I think mostly it's just because the U.S. Didn't do its homework on this one.
So give us two views, then, of what to expect after the current 60-day negotiating period. On the one hand, the best we can reasonably expect, and on the other, what you actually think, where you actually think negotiations will stand after 60 days?
So I think, it's a great question. I think the best place where this could end up is you have clarity on the Strait of Hormuz and you have some smaller nuclear concessions, right? The IAEA is back in there doing CSA investigations at all the sites, right? We don't even have that yet. So if we get to that place, I think that would be really good. First step, and that's sustainable. You can live in that situation for a number of years and maybe to a future administration. My worry is is that we'll only get, a partial version of that. We'll still have Iran insisting on fees. There are more maritime traffic will be going through, but it's going to be contested, and Iran will continue to threaten the Strait like they did over the weekend, and that's really bad. And then on the nuclear front, sure, we have this oral commitment that the IAEA will go back in, but do they have permission to visit sites that they've never visited before? The IAEA was there in 2025, right before the war started, to inspect a new site that they never inspected before, and the war started, and we still haven't seen it. Will they get access to that site? Will they get access to the sites that were bombed in 2025? We have no idea. And so, my worry is that none of these will be resolved 2 months from now.
Thanks for talking us through that and sharing your insights, Nate. Nate Swanson from the Atlantic Council.
Thank you very much.